What's poppin', everybody? It's your boy Gsluke here with some course breakdown action. We've got the Houston Open Memorial Park Golf Club this week, but would be remiss if we don't touch on the Henley hype train. Last week, our prototype when it came to course build, somebody that was accurate off the tee, solid approach play, and historically at least, one of the better putters that we have on tour, was exactly what we were looking for. And you saw that with our core breakdown. It was one of the 6 guys that I was targeting up top, despite being one of the lower owned plays as well. And, you know, if you played him in fantasy, you bet him outright, you obviously saw a huge return there. So, pat on the back there for anybody that was a course breakdown fanatic like myself, somebody looking at the stats. Even with the form coming in, I don't think a lot of people would have known to play a Russell Henley, but that's why we do these course breakdowns. That's why we try and break down historically what plays, what sort of players that you want to be getting to, because you're going to get those breakout performances. And sure, he wasn't the safest play, but that's why you're getting him at such high odds, right? That's why you had so much value from the outright market, whereas now he's in the 10K range when it comes to DFS. His outright number is half of what it was just last week. That's why we do these videos, is so you can go out there and get that sort of value when it isn't really as obvious as it may be in some other sort of golf tournament. So that's the idea here. This week we have the Houston Open, as I mentioned. We'll be going through everything you need to know about this week's venue. That is Memorial Park. We'll go through some of the specifics, so just everything you need to know about the venue. Make sure we're on the same page. We'll go hole by hole, breaking down some of the shots that players will be facing. And at the end, the most important part of the video, we'll go through my key stats for analysis, the types of metrics I'll be using to identify my top plays, and of course, my comp courses around the PGA Tour too that should play similar to what we should see this week and that you can use for some of your correlation analysis. So that's what we've got, a lot on the menu. Let's go ahead and dive on in. Actually, a Muni course down in Houston. Memorial Park is a John Bredemus design back in 1935. But really, it's worth noting, it's nowhere near the same golf course as what you had there about almost 90 years ago, with a Doak and Brooks Koepka redesign there in 2019. I emphasize the Brooks Koepka part because, if you look on the PGA Tour website, they have absolutely no information on that. It looks like they've conveniently left it out because of, obviously Brooks going to live. But I'm going to point that out because that is just hard on facts. He had a redesign along with Tom Doak there in 2019. So keep that in mind. Par 70, 3 par 5s. So a little interesting there. For a par 70, you have the 3 par 5s and 5 par 3s, and at 7,412 yards. So despite there being an extra par 3, sure, one of the par 4s is now a par 5 as well, it's still over 7,400 yards for a par 70. That would be long for a par 72, frankly, but for a par 70, that is exceptionally long, putting it along some of the longest golf tournaments per shot on all of the entire PGA Tour. The scoring average was 0.8 shots over par, so a 70.8 there with the par 70 setup, and that was with relatively soft conditions. If you look at the highlights from round 1, rounds 4, they talked about how receptive the greens were early in the morning. They had rain there Wednesday evening. Also, over Saturday night, they had a little bit of a sprinkle, so conditions were ripe for the taking there, yet you still saw, a scoring average close to 1 shot over par, and with even firmer and faster conditions projected for at least the first 2, probably 3 rounds of this golf tournament, I would expect the scoring average to maybe be even worse here in 2022. Something to note is that there is a shower, at least projected as of right now. It's really early in the week here on a Monday, for Saturday evening. So if that does come through, maybe it comes through a day earlier, perhaps after the golf tournament is over, that would change how we project the field. But as of right now, I'm at least expecting 2-3 rounds of firm and fast conditions and a scoring average probably closer to 1, maybe 1.5 strokes over par as a result. Let's break this down from the fairway in. So first off, we've got the fairways. They are 31.6 yards wide, which is about 3.8 yards narrower than what you're used to seeing, which leads to a 64.2% fairway rate. So only 1.8% lower in terms of your fairway percentage than what we're used to seeing week to week. But that was with receptive conditions. So keep in mind that they're probably going to be a little bit harder to hit this time around. They are a 419 Bermuda. The rough is 2.5 inches long, so if you're missing the short stuff, you're going to be in a 2.5 inch 419 Bermuda. But the missed fairway penalty, because it's only 2.5 inches, was only 0.27 shots last year, and that was with wet conditions. If anything, wet conditions can make the rough a little bit more penal, and that was 0.1 shots less than the tour average when it comes to your penalty. So if it was going to be harder than usual last year, and it still was easier than tour average to get out of the rough there, don't expect it to be any more difficult this time around if it's a little bit more wispy. The real defense here, where you really get the scoring average, because fairway percentage was slightly lower than what you're used to seeing. The rough isn't all that much of a penalty, are the greens, and that's not because they're hard to hit. They are 7,000 square foot on average, so right about tour average in terms of their size. They are hit at a 64.4% clip, which is 3.8% less than what you're used to seeing, but that's not drastically below the average. The issue is that the greens are extremely complex. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the greens. When we go hole by hole, you're not really going to get a full perspective for how difficult they are. So we're going to touch on a lot of that here. So they are a mini Verde Bermuda, so not the 419 like you have in the fairways in the rough. But they are running about a 12 to 13 on the stimp meter. They'll probably start close to a 12, 12 and a half, maybe get close to a 13 over the weekend if we don't get that rain. But they are raised green surfaces, so they're about 2, maybe 3 yards raised from the rest of the property. They have quite a bit of undulation on the sides as well. So anytime you have an approach shot that's maybe just a little bit off in terms of your precision, you're going to hit one of the slopes towards the side of the green and roll off, kind of similar to a Southern Hills, which you saw for the PGA Championship. It has that kind of effect. Other golf courses on tour where you have a shaved off effect, like at Mayakoba, there are plenty of holes that have these little chipping areas. It's a common feature of plenty of tracks that we see, except when you're running on a firm and fast golf course, greens that are running 12, 12 and a half on the stimp meter, it brings them especially so into play. And usually we see that at major championships. It's why we want firm and fast conditions when we're getting to some of these classical designs, are to bring in those chipping hollows, to make the golf course a little bit more difficult. And that's the defense of Memorial Park Golf Club, which is interesting because this is a muni. This is a golf course that me and you could go play, right, for a little bit of a tee time. It's not even that expensive because it's a local muni, yet it brings this tactical, very much so traditional style of golf into play, like what you used to see back there 50, 60 years ago. This is how they used to defend almost every single golf course. So I love it. There's a ton of subtle breaks on the greens too, so they're not massively sloped. That's something that I did talk about last year. It's a misnomer. A lot of other people in the industry were talking up the greens here as being extremely sloped. That's not the case. They're raised, they have slope towards the sides that'll run you off the green, and sure, you can't put up those slopes. Those are very, very severe when you're actually getting onto the green. But once you're on the surfaces here, and I've watched the broadcast all of last year, you can also see a lot of it on the highlights, they're very subtle breaks. 1-2% grades at the very most. If people are doing their little aim point out there, they're only going to be using like 1, maybe 2 fingers at the very most. They're trying to get that break, but they're subtle breaks, and a lot of times you get double, sometimes triple breakers on some of the longer putts that you're facing, and that adds a little bit of difficulty. So the guys that are better putters have had success on these greens over the years, and specifically the guys that are best on Bermuda grass. So something that I'm taking a look at. A few other things to talk about. The greens are the real defense. We talked about that. But the redesign also took plenty of the greenside bunkers out of play. So before the redesign, when Doak and Koepka came into here, they had 53 bunkers on property. Now they're down to, I believe, 19. So they took out pretty much close to 30, actually a little bit over 30 bunkers there from property. And most of them were the greenside bunkers. So rather than having chip it out, little bunker shots that players are hitting where they're able to apply spin to the golf ball, get them to stop 2 to 3 feet away from some of these pin locations. They've made them fairway spots where instead of being able to apply a ton of spin to the golf ball, you may have to play a little bump and run into the slope. You might have to play a flop shot to try and get it to stop with that same sort of spin. It adds a lot of difficulty to the around the green. So that's the main change, I would say, since 2019. It's still, right around that same distance. They did add a little bit of length to the golf course, but more than anything, they made the greens a little bit more severe, added some slope to these greens, made them a little bit more subtle, and removed the bunkers, which from maybe a generalistic standpoint might seem to make the course easier, but that would be for me and you, right? Our bunker games aren't nearly as pristine or outrageously good as some of these tour players, but for them, it definitely adds a little bit of difficulty. All right, going to take this hole by hole now and give you an idea of what these players are facing. Hole number 1 is not a par 5, so ignore the screen here. This has been converted to a par 4 and was the most difficult hole in the entire golf tournament in terms of your scoring average. So they shortened it up. They played it 2 tee boxes up, closer to 497 yards. But even so, a difficult driving hole, at least difficult to keep it in the short stuff. There's not a ton to worry about in terms of trees. I mean, to the left, you can see it's wide open. To the right, a few trees to worry about, but just enough room where players can bomb away on the first tee. It's more the second shot and the green where players have to worry. Again, this is designed to be a par 5, so Doak and Koepka made this a difficult green complex, assuming that most players would be trying to get up and down for a birdie, not tour players from right around 200 yards trying to make a par. So it's a difficult hole. You just try and get it on the surface and 2-putt, but you can see some of the characteristics we were talking about. Not a ton of fairway bunkering nor greenside bunkering. You can see just the one lone bunker over here, and it's not a very big one. A lot of fairway area and chipping hollows, though. And if you're missing even by just a yard or two here to some of these pin locations, you could be short-sighted and in a heap of trouble. They're going to put the pins along some of those ridges too. So, in that back left, you can see the chipping area where you'd be leaving yourself a really difficult short-sighted shot. If you end up in the bunker to the right, to maybe a back right pin or a front right pin location, that may also be a little bit more difficult than you're expecting. This is a well-designed golf course. So hole number 1, an absolute bear. Hole 2, 164 yards, so it's a par 3. There are 5 on property, I'll remind you of that, 3 par 5s. This is an easier hole, right? It's still a little bit difficult because the par 3s tend to be some of the more difficult greens on property, much like the par 5s, where you tend to get a little bit more of a break or on those par 4s, but still hit an iron shot on there. If you can be precise, it is a birdie look at just 160 yards. Hole 3 is a par 5, 588. It should be gettable in 2 by the longer players, but unless you have, I'd say 305, 310 yards with carry, you're probably not getting there in 2. It's going to take 2 big lashes either way, and much like hole number 1, it's a complex, small green. They really try to test you with your around the green play on these par 5s. And last year, the guys that had the most success on these holes were the short game specialists. Players that were either hitting wedge into the greens and finding a lot of precision, or getting it up their green side in 2 and getting up and down. That's kind of the MO for the par 5s here. You're not going to see a lot of eagles or players getting on the surface in 2. Hole 4 is 487, a relatively straightforward driving hole. I mean, you do have the shrubs and trees to the right. You can get in a little bit of trouble to the left, but it's one of the larger fairways on property. The green, though, right, is where you get the trade-off. It's one of the smaller greens on property. I mean, it looks like an absolute postage stamp out there. So you definitely don't want to miss. And much like every single green, it's raised up. It kind of looks like a little bit of a volcano from the overhead look. And that's what it looks like from the ground, too, right? These chipping hollows in 360 degrees around this green are a solid 2-3 yards below the surface, which, with a tiny target like that, makes this a difficult hole. Like pretty much every hole around this property. One of the few holes that you can get, especially if you're one of the longer players, is hole number 5. It tends to play downwind, so you will get players that get it close to this bunker, believe it or not, leaving yourself a little flip wedge in. So despite this golf course being difficult, you are going to get a few opportunities. I mean, the 3 par 5s are birdie looks at the very least. Also a few little short par 4s too. So it's not going to be all 500-yard par 4s, holes that you're just hoping to make par on at best. You're going to have at least a few scoring looks. Next up is a 443-yard par 4. It's not really that difficult. It doesn't have that much of an identity. It is a dogleg from right to left, so it's worth noting there. Jason Kokrak, last year's winner, is a noted right to left ball flight player, has one of the most beautiful draws in all of professional golf. So maybe this is one of the holes where he sees that advantage, right? So I'll try and point that out going into the future. But even Carlos Ortiz, who won the tournament before, also has a little bit of a draw bias. Hole 8 is 215, so a longer par 3. It's slightly uphill as well. You do have the chipping hollow over the green, the whole right side and in front, and also a green side bunker. So this is a well-defended hole, definitely a par hole at best. Hole 8 is another par 5, so you do have 2 par 5s on the front, just 1 par 5 on the back, and this one is 612, so it's on the longer end of the spectrum. You're not really going to reach here in 2 unless you have 2 just massive shots. I mean, Scotty might get there, Tony, and Sam Burns, right? Those 3 players, if they have 2 perfect shots, might get it close to the front of the green. But if you're going for it, you bring this OB into play. So over here on the right, where you can see some of the service areas, I suppose would probably be the best word for it. I'm not sure exactly what it is, would be OB. So you're bringing some risk into play on the right side. To the left, you also have a little bit of a ditch. This is a penalty area the whole way down the left. You can see it turns into an actual aquatic area further up on the golf course. Just don't want to miss. So you're not going to see a lot of players going for it. Most will lay up, leave themselves a little flip wedge in, and still a solid birdie look. Hole 9 is the last par 3 on the front. It is 200 yards, and much like 2 holes ago, is a relatively difficult hole. On the back 9, you do have quite a few longer holes. 456 if you're starting on hole number 10. I believe they will have them starting off both tees. So hole number 1, the most difficult hole on the golf course. This would actually be the handshake compared to the 2. So if I was going to choose golfers for showdown, and I know a lot of people ask about this, I'd probably want guys starting on hole number 10. So that's, my 2 cents on that argument. But a still relatively difficult hole. 11 is 241, so an extremely lengthy par 3, the most difficult par 3 on property. Hole 12 is 501 yards, so way out there in terms of your distance. I feel like I'm getting repetitive at this point, but it's straightforward. It's a relatively small landing area off the tee, not a ton of trees on this hole, so you can definitely give it a mighty lash. But it's a small green, a relatively narrow green too. It's not like it has that much depth to it. You got to hit your spots. Hole 13 is 409 yards, a shorter par 4. This one is gettable. It's, kind of like that 390-yard par 4 that we had before. You're going to get a few opportunities where you can put a wedge in hand, a degreed wedge, going after a pin, trying to put it to 5-10 feet, that sort of thing. But they're sporadic, right? You have the par 5s where you're going to get that opportunity, and then 2, maybe 3 other holes the entire round where that's going to be the case. Hole 14 is not a par 5, so this is the second most difficult hole on property last year, and it's 533 yards, so they're not shortening it unless they decide for maybe moving day to make it a little bit easier. They might move it up a tee box or 2, but for a majority of the tournament, you're going to see this play as a 500-yard par 4, so it's going to be extremely difficult. The green complex is difficult like all of the other par 5s, and a hole that you're just hoping to make par on, kind of like hole number 1. Hole 15 is 150 yards, so it is the shortest par 3 on property. You're going to have a pitching wedge, maybe a 9-iron into the wind in hand here, and it should be a birdie look, except that the green is extremely difficult, kind of like the par 3 on the early part of the round that was right around, I believe, 167 yards was the scorecard yardage on that one. They're both a lot more difficult than it looks like on paper. Hole 16 is your last par 5, but it is the most difficult par 5 in terms of your driver, right? It's 580 yards, so hard to reach into anyways, but you have water the whole way down the right. So off the tee, you can't miss over there. If you miss to the left, you're in the trees. And even on your layup, right, it's a little bit more testy than you'd like. You have the water to the right, trees to the left. If you can execute 2 solid shots for a layup, you are going to leave yourself 70, maybe 80 yards at the very most into the green, which is great. I mean, even for some of the tucked locations to the back left or back right, you're still looking at 5-10 feet most likely. I mean, these tour players from 70, 80 yards, it's almost a gimme birdie at that point. So hole 16, as long as you can keep it in play, I like your chances. But boy, oh boy, are those some difficult shots, even for the layup there. Hole 17, you still got the water in play, so this final stretch is really a lot of fun. The tee shot, the more aggressive you are, I would argue, the less risk you bring into play. So on hole 17, if you just drive it the whole way down the left, you can bring the water out of play. The areas near the cart path over here are going to be worn out like crazy this week, just because of players not wanting to hit it into the water. And if you can leave yourself like 70, 80 yards out of the rough over here, I think most players feel pretty comfortable hitting that to like 10, 15 feet. So expect a lot of guys to bail out long over here to the left. And finally, hole 18, your closing hole, is 494, and it's a brute. I mean, get it out there in the fairway, you're hoping to at least, and you still got 180, maybe 190 yards into the green. It's just hold on and hope at that point. You're not going to see a lot of people making birdies here at 18. And if anything, right, I think a par is probably going to gain you a third, maybe half a stroke on the field here on a Sunday. Now that we've seen the golf course, let's get into these key stats. So at number 1, we've got shots gained around the green, which, yep, I'm going to say it again because you might not believe me there. Yeah, shots gained around the green. Number 1, definitely something that is new here. We haven't done that for quite some time, but with how small the targets are, if taking a look at the leaderboard last year, the around the green guys definitely got it done. So if you're somebody who models this like a major championship, we're looking at the firm and fast conditions that you see a lot of times in Texas, then you got paid out last year, and that was despite us getting a ton of rain. So I mentioned that off the hop, that the scoring conditions were still well over par despite it being receptive last year. I mean, if it's going to play firm and fast, and it's going to be even more so the case this time. And last year, shots gained around the green was the most correlated stat to success. So I know it's a small sample size, but I'm expecting it to get even more difficult this time around. So something I'm trying to jump on early. So shots gained around the green, definitely something I don't talk up very often here, but, I think it's especially so going to be the case this week. Next up, we've got driving distance, another stat that might surprise a few people here, but with all the room players have off the tee, I see a lot of the bombers having at least a lot more ability to be aggressive. I mean, at a course like Harbor Town, like we saw at Mayakoba, I mean, you really couldn't hit driver there all that often. Before that at Port Royal, another golf course that takes driver out of your hand. These distance specialists have not really been able to take advantage of that the Fortinet's kind of the same way. Sanderson Farms is another one of those courses you can't always hit driver off the tee. You're finally getting to a Bombers Fest sort of place. And if you're looking at some of the recent form, recent finishes, it's going to point you to a lot of those precision players. And that's really what I've been honing in on, right? We have been talking about how it's always accuracy over distance off the tee, right? For like the last month and a half here for these course breakdowns, but we're finally getting to the other side of that equation. So I like when it flips the script because a lot of people looking at recent form are going to be enamored with some of those precision guys, but this week it's definitely a distance over an accuracy week. So keep that in mind when you're looking at players. And lastly, we've got shots gained approach, which is typically number 1, right? We knew it was going to make the top 3 here, but it's worth noting that players are going to have a lot more long irons in hand, a lot of those 175 to 200 yard shots, as you saw there on the hole by hole breakdown, 200 to 225, and also that 250 yard plus range is overutilized this week compared to most on tour. So make sure you keep all of those things in mind when you're looking at your key players, but also things I'm looking at are shots gained at hard golf courses. So I would classify that as anything with a scoring average over 0.5 over par. Looking at shots gained putting on Bermuda, which of course is the surface of the week. All right, now that we've seen the key stats, let's get into these comp courses. At number 1, we've got Congaree Golf Club. I was there just a few weeks ago raving about how much I liked that venue, but from a course fit perspective, especially from what kind of key stats that we're looking at, I think there's a lot of crossover, and now that we have 2 years worth of data, it's a lot more actionable than we had before. So a few of the things that I think will be similar. First off, the elevation change. Almost every single green at Congaree was elevated, had that same sort of runoff effect as what you're going to see at Memorial Park. So it checks that box. Their Bermuda grass from tee to green, so it also was able to check that box. And on top of that, they were running extremely fast, right? So 13s to 14s on the stimp meter. It's going to be closer to like a 12.5, maybe 13 this week. But in either way, it simulates a lot of the similar conditions where around the green was extremely important. Driving distance was also something that was important around Congaree. So I think there's quite a few crossovers that can be made. And of course, it is a recent event that we can pull shots gained data from. Next up, we've got TPC Scottsdale. So the home of the Waste Management Phoenix Open, a course with similar elevated greens. It's Bermuda grass over there at Scottsdale. And furthermore, you're dealing with a course that prioritizes your off the tee distance and accuracy. It's a little bit wide open on a few holes, and then kind of like what you have on 16 and 17 for this golf course, a few holes where you really got to keep it in play, where you have water on both sides of the fairway, where you're going to get an extremely difficult test. That's similar to that closing 4 or 5 hole stretch at Scottsdale. So the greens, similar, they have a lot of undulation. They tend to run fast kind of like a Congaree golf club there too. From the correlation standpoint, a lot of people that have had success at Scottsdale have also had plenty of success in the small sample size of it, right? Just 2 years here around this track, but also at this golf course Memorial Park. And lastly, we have Bay Hill Club and Lodge, the home of the API. It's a Bermuda grass course, relatively long down there in Florida with difficult, fast greens. So those are the kind of crossovers. It's not really the same from like the visual standpoint. One of them's a Florida course, has a lot more water in play there with the Bay Hill. Also tends to be a little bit windier than what you get here at Memorial Park, but both of them are firm and fast. The difficult greens is really the key characteristic that you get crossover from. And similar to a TPC Scottsdale, it's up there in the top 5 from a correlation standpoint when you're looking at some of the leaderboards. So I know with those number 2 and 3 picks, I'm looking at the correlations. It's only a 2-year sample size, but when you pair that from the logical standpoint, from the eye test standpoint, especially from the green complexes, it's great to have that reassurance there. All right, fellas, that is all I've got for this week's course breakdown. Hopefully you feel a little bit more prepared than you did before and are ready to go ahead and smash this week. I'm looking forward to it. I think it plays even more difficult than what we've seen in years past. So for my winning score, I'm going to go ahead and take 7 under par. I think you see it play maybe a stroke and a half over in terms of your scoring average. But go ahead and let me know your thoughts down below and what you think your winning score is going to be. But until next time, best of luck with all of those outrights, any DFS lineups that we decide to enter. I will have the full slate of content dropping this week from the core picks, value picks, our weekly DFS live stream, and some showdown content over the weekend. We've got Shot Tracker, a much more enjoyable event from the fans' perspective. So overall, looking forward to the fireworks over there in Houston, and can't wait to bring you guys the rest of the content. But until then, best of luck. Make sure you hit that like button if you haven't already, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of that content when it drops in the future. But best of luck, guys, and I'll catch you guys next time.